Welcome to Digital Aesthetics, and thanks for everyone for coming out again after being here last week with Brian. This week we have Yvette. Woo! Just to introduce the workshop again with some very brief words, Digital Aesthetics is an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary space where we can rethink media objects, approaches, and technologies and the ways in which we interact with the world. As per usual, we will have 1 hour of presentation and then 1 hour of Q&A. And as per usual, we have snacks and wine and beer in the back, so feel free to help yourselves throughout the presentation. Please keep any questions to the end for the Q&A session, and this will be recorded, but TBD if it will be uploaded online. For Zoom participants, if you have any questions, please enter them into the chat. We also want to extend our thanks to the Department of Feminism, Gender, and Sexuality Studies for co-sponsoring this event, and to the Clayman Institute as well. So thank you for both. And without further ado, I'll pass it on to Hank, who will introduce Yvette.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce Yvette Granata, who is a media artist, filmmaker, and digital media scholar. She is assistant professor at the University of Michigan in the Department of Film, Television, and Media, and the Digital Studies Institute. She creates immersive installations, video art, VR experiences, and interactive environments, and writes about digital culture, media art, and media theory. I have a huge list here of places where her work has been represented, which I will not read just for the sake of getting to the presentation, which I'm excited about. But her most recent VR project, I Took a Lethal Dose of Herbs, premiered at CPHDOX, as I say it. Fox in 2023, won Best VR Film at Cannes World Film Awards and received an honorable mention at the Prix Electronica in Linz, Austria. So without further ado, Yvette.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks so much for having me here today. This is really exciting. I've been watching on Zoom some of the other talks for the last couple of years, and I was like, I want to go there, and then Grace invited me, so I'm really excited about that. And I took the note to heart that it's, presenting like new work in progress and things that are, really like in the works, so that's what this presentation is. And so I want to kind of say like how this talk is going to go. I'm a hybrid media artist and a media scholar, and I work in 2 ways. One as an artist and the other as a media theorist, where I perform the critical analysis of digital culture and media technologies. And often the technologies that I'm analyzing are things that I'm also using to, in my creative practice. So sometimes I'm doing creative work and critical analysis at the same time. Sometimes I do creative work first and then I reflect on the process. Sometimes I'm doing and thinking through the theoretical or the political or the aesthetics first, and then later I make something related to it and I go into like production mode. So I have all these different ways of working. And I'm going to use some of my VR/XR media artworks as examples in the talk. One that I completed last year, I Took a Lethal Dose of Herbs, and one that I'm working on right now that is very much a work in progress and early stages. And while I'm going to talk about these creative works as like examples during the talk, it's not an artist talk. It's weird and hybrid in its formats, and moves between me talking about like my artistic projects and this broader concept of mimetic virtualities that I'm trying to build. So it's really me trying to talk about this as a conceptual project about like what is this concept of mimetic virtualities, and building it out as like a broader cultural, political, aesthetic, concept that is questioning things more tied to analysis of social and technological tools of virtual production, and doing it through some of the technologies of virtual productions, and also looking at digital culture within that. But I'm going to do that more so than really like go into deep explanations of the works that I'm presenting. So that's a different talk. And the title of my talk is Mimetic Virtualities, Rendering the Masses and/or Feminist Media Arts. And the subtitle is about, includes or feminist media art, ? Which is kind of a sidebar that describes my practice and the projects that I'm doing, but I won't necessarily talk about feminist media art directly. So that's a sidebar. And then lastly, I just want to say that it is very much a work in progress. So there's a little bit of like a hodgepodge in terms of the presentation, like bookmarks of different things. Okay, so although VR appeared in the 1970s as a technology, it wasn't until 2016 that it became a mass media. In the work I'm doing right now, I'm primarily interested in VR as a mass media. So I have this timeline that I cobbled together, and it represents here on the left the number of headsets developed according to years, just starting with 1993. I got it from this website that is about VR headsets throughout history. So the red is 1993 up at the top. The next year is 1994, 1995, then 2000, 2002. And then when we get to the pink in the middle here is 2016, where there were over 9 headsets suddenly produced on the market. And then this is where, consumer grade headsets became more available and people started to buy them at affordable prices. Like the one up here from the corner, 2002 is like $26,000. And then Oculus in 2016 made a headset for $400. So, VR as a mass media includes not just the headsets and the spatial graphics that are developed for it, but also the whole ecosystem of media technologies that supports it, which includes the tools of production, such as open source game engines and 3D animation tools, that all start to be developed in a way that connect into VR production. So for example, I use Unity often in my work, which is a game engine, and there's like a plugin to directly connect to an Oculus headset. So 2016, year 0 for that. On the other side of the timeline is the timeline of the Q-anon conspiracy, which began with Pizzagate in October of 2016, which is right before the 2016 elections. And I use Q-anon to represent a kind of shift in conspiracy theories in American culture. So although conspiracy theories have long been a part of American history, in the 21st century, there's been a change to the nature of conspiracy. Previously, the external events were agreed upon, at least in terms of they were all presented in mass culture. For example, JFK's assassination, the moon landing, were events that were in the media, and the conspiracy theories behind them provided an alternative explanation to the mainstream explanation. In the 21st century, the event that a conspiracy theory explains, such as Pizzagate, is created by and contained within the conspiracy. So the reality of the conspiracy is contained within itself, or is the production of this reality bubble. So in this way, what I'm saying here is that 2016 marks the beginning of a push towards the control of reality by any means necessary, or by multiple means. And I'm not saying that there's a causal relationship here between these two timelines, that Oculus came out with its headset and then that made Pizzagate happen. I'm more so just kind of painting a picture of this zeitgeist of these new kinds of digital realities that are being constructed, and the way that they're being pushed from something that was more fringe to something more mainstream. So VR was a more fringe technology, became a mass media, and conspiracy theories always had a sort of fringe world and then became more mass form. And the mimetic aesthetics of the digital masses has really been epitomized by the aesthetics of memes. So when we think of digital mimetic aesthetics, we think of memes. And in the last 10 years, there's also been a shift in memes because they've become a part of the production of the conspiracy narratives. So Carolyn Sanders has a work called A Certain Kind of Doom Scrolling that I think is a great example of a work that traces this sort of change to mimetic aesthetics within the sort of last few years of the post-Pizzagate years. And is tied to the like shift of conspiracy as mass form as represented in memes. And in this project, she traces the hashtag Save the Children. It kind of shows like how it's used all over the world. So like when it's being used in the US context, it means Pizzagate or Q-anon, and then in other places in the world, it's about like stopping child hunger and things like that. So this is kind of the social media aesthetics of mimetic virtualities. Following along in the vein of this kind of discourse on the aesthetics of digital mimesis and its relation to contemporary populism, I am trying to look further specifically to where populist mimetic aesthetics and aesthetics of virtual and augmented reality intertwine. So I'm doing this on various levels in building this concept. So here, so for example, these are kind of a bunch of examples on here, but one example is the VR chat environment for Four Seasons, which was created during the 2020 elections, and after there was the Four Seasons total landscaping event, press conference with Trump, which is an instance of like virtualizing of an actual political event that like just immediately becomes satirical in VR, but also is simultaneously a space for furries to meet in the VR chat space, and that's still up, you can still go in there. The opposite is looking at the way that AR filters and other VR production tools are used, such as creating lizard faces that become a part of conspiracy theories about lizard overlords. And people use them to like edit video to like say like, here's the lizard eyeballs that show up. And so I'm looking to the way that like these contemporary conspiracy cultures use these tools in a collective production, similar to the way you would create an interactive game design itself. So the visual tool specifically is what I am looking at. Another leg or chapter that I am looking at is on the aesthetics of VR and anti-abortion cultures online, and how the politics of pregnancy are represented in virtual space, specifically with VR pregnancy apps that have an explicit ideology of the way an unborn child is represented in virtual space, which was what I talked about at SLSA. A lot of you were there. And then lastly, what I'm talking about today is another leg of this concept where I look at motion capture and the way that multiple bodies become mimetic material for virtual content, and how rendering technologies treat the imaging of crowds. Okay, so first I'm gonna go on a little journey. Part 2, mimetics and common sense. So I once was going to build an AR app that was a tool for identifying abortifacient plants that can be used for herbal abortions as a kind of DIY knowledge app. But then I came across forums where people were sharing their stories about how they accidentally poisoned themselves. And seeing how many people hurt themselves attempting DIY herbal abortions, I started to feel that my field guide concept was potentially dangerous. But neither did I want to create a project saying, here are the plants, but don't do this, it's bad, or shake a finger at anyone who felt that they needed to perform a DIY abortion. So instead, I started to collect stories from online forums about self-poisonings as another type of knowledge sharing, as warnings and as messages of shared experiences that are meant to build more of a kind of shared space and a camaraderie around that, about sharing those experiences that people are doing within these digital commons and in different forums. So one story that I found on Reddit became the subject matter of my project, I Took a Lethal Dose of Herbs, which is an interactive animated VR film told from the first-person perspective of an anonymous woman. And the story is based on a Reddit post by a former anti-abortion activist who once spent her weekends praying outside of abortion clinics. But then her life took a turn after the birth of her first child, as she suffered a psychotic break from the postpartum psychosis. After recovering and becoming unexpectedly pregnant again, she then attempts a DIY herbal abortion and accidentally poisons herself. So I'm going to play a clip, kind of. Okay.
My refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust.
In whom I trust.
From birth I was cast on you, from my mother's womb you have been my God.
From my mother's womb, you have been my God.
You shall not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day.
I think I'm finally ready to tell my story. I think I'm finally ready to talk about my abortion. It's been a year.
Hi everyone. Thanks for joining in on Zoom on this beautiful day.
Is the demon king. I have many followers. You are merely a vessel of my will. Your body is not real. It is an empty shell, a machine for the unborn animal. The time has come for my chosen ones to enter into my kingdom. All hail the Yah Messiah. All hail the smiley face emoji with the split tongue, smiley eyes, a laughing emoji, devil emoji with a hat. All hail the new Yah emoji Messiah.
She had no emotion in her face. It wasn't easy for her. And then the unicorn devil came to her and tried to take all of her power away. She wouldn't let it happen, so she used her princess power. And she took away the unicorn devil's evil crown. And it vanished. And then she went to sleep, realizing that unicorns weren't even real. But then she went to sleep again. Mommy? Mommy? Mommy?
Is to take them during the 5th week of pregnancy, as most miscarriages
Dosage is
happen
sometimes
around the
combined
6th
with
week.
rue.
Works
After
as
the
a
uterine
7th week.
stimulus.
It is
The berries
dangerous to
and leaves
continue
are
with
used.
herbal methods. Steep for about 10
Just
to
when I
20
was
minutes.
finally feeling a new normal,
Half a teaspoon of
I
carrot
found
root,
out
steep
I
for
was
30
pregnant
minutes.
again.
1.5 dried
When I
herbs,
told Matt,
used 20 times a day for 30
I begged him
minutes.
to kill me.
Half a cup of herbs with 1 teaspoon of leaves.
I
3
wanted
days,
to
3
die
times a day, 6
instead of go
teaspoons, 4
through
cups
another
every hour.
pregnancy.
20
And
cups 4 times an
was
hour,
terrified
6
of losing my
teaspoons of
mind
herbs for
again.
30 days. May cause seizures, profuse bleeding,
I started
and
to
weakened
take
pulse.
a lethal
May
dose of
increase
herbs.
urination. Prolonged doses
It was early
can cause
on.
dilated pupils,
I thought I
inflammation
was
of the
just
stomach, blistering,
helping a natural
irritable bowel,
process
and
along.
severe birth defect. May cause
I thought I
seizures,
knew what I was
profuse
doing.
bleeding, and weakened pulse.
I didn't.
May increase urination.
Pregnancy
Prolonged
was
doses
making me
can cause
suicidal.
dilated pupils, inflammation of the stomach.
Great triumph, not of a candidate, but of a cause. The cause of democracy. The people, the will of the people, has been heard, and the will of the people has been heeded. We've learned again that democracy is precious. Democracy is precious. At this hour, my friends, democracy has prevailed. So now, on this hallowed ground, with just a few days to go, violent sought to shake the Capitol's very foundation. We come together as one nation,
Okay.
under God, indivisible.
My refuge and my fortress.
Okay, so that was an excerpt of the piece. It's a 20-minute experience overall. And in this project, I was focusing a lot on how to represent this online culture about DIY abortion experiences and this specific anonymous story without being judgmental or critical of the actions within it. And as a way to bring forward this common experience that it taps into and the ethos of the stories that were being shared in the subreddit thread. The knowledge surrounding DIY abortion practice is an old knowledge of the commons and is something that has been passed down in whispers for centuries. In her recent book, Making Sense in Common, philosopher Isabel Stengers unpacks Whitehead's approach to the concept of common sense as something that has been lost to philosophy and that we must return to. One of the things that Stengers points out is that after the science wars of the 20th century, expert knowledge of the laws of science meant that common sense became merely synonymous with ignorance. Experts had the key to all the knowledge while the people remained ignorant. Whereas Whitehead had attempted to marry the two, common sense and knowledge, through this concept of brooding. So this is Stengers. What the science wars made apparent is that common sense is now nothing other than public opinion, subject to influence readily seduced by the critic's proposition. Without these science laws, nothing would hold back the irrational passions. All would be permitted, each person with their truth, even flat earth advocates. It is now accepted that people are no longer capable of questioning, of brooding. What Whitehead dubbed common sense is no longer something to be reckoned with or to be counted on. And so Stengers points out that brooding is a form of knowledge of the commons, and that it's something that we have to revisit and keep alive as a place to think in a better way, because there is knowledge to be found and mined when brooding occurs. And so, like, further explaining this concept of brooding, she says, voicelessly perhaps and without necessarily deploying a contradictory discourse, to brood is to refuse to lose confidence in the value of experience, even if experience is difficult to put into words, even if it is placed in a position of difficulty by a theory aiming to discredit it. I see mimetic aesthetics as aligned with the concept of brooding. As a form of knowledge of the commons that points out that something is wrong, whether or not the language is appropriately expressing what is wrong. The meme aesthetics within my VR experience are deployed in moments when the main character is beginning to have a psychosis episode. For example, in the second scene on the right here, in the bedroom, there's a stream of memes that change and they get weirder and darker as a way to indicate that her psychosis is beginning. And we pass into a new state of reality inside of the character's mind, the lights go off, and the demon babies come out of the closet. And these images are the only images that were not explicitly created for the piece. They're things that I found online by searching for anti-liberal memes and face swap. And so while I look to mimetic aesthetics as a mode of brooding in one kind of area of this project, I also look to unpack other mimetic virtualities tied to other conceptual frameworks of mimesis. And of course, there's multiple ways that the concept of mimesis has been used since like the beginning of philosophy. And I'm really using a lot of work by Adriana Cavarero right now, who's a feminist Italian philosopher who's been writing about mimesis in a lot of different ways, whether explicitly or blatantly throughout her work. And so this is from an article that is actually a dialogue, Mimetic Inclinations, a dialogue with Adriana Cavarero. So through this, she explained, like, we have mimesis from Plato, which refers to the shadows in the cave, and the shadows are a deteriorated version of reality. And humans are, in fact, drawn to these shadows, which is also a description of art. And for Plato, art is dangerous. We also have the literary studies definition tied to Aristotle's Poetics, in which mimesis is not a shadow of reality, but that has origins tied to actions such as ritualistic corporeal practices, for example, dance, where mimetic movements invoke things such as the mimesis of emotion, the mimesis of character. And so in a way, the action mirrors another process that is happening. So like a movement is mimetic of an emotion. Then there is affective mimesis, which is an embodied, imminent, contagious, and relational process, and comes more from this sort of psychological mirroring where, humans are, where humans are mimetic creatures that are prone to imitate each other. And then 4 is Cavarero's version of mimesis, which is complex, but uses Plato's mimesis, but as an anti-Platonist. And she says that there is no hierarchy of forms versus stratas, but instead a relational mimesis in which we as people can only be represented through the presence of others and in a co-production with others. Drawing heavily from Hannah Arendt's ontology of politics is the appearance of the people in the commons as a plurality, but also she uses some of the literary concept of mimesis in terms of like telling your autobiography. You can't do that alone. Other people have to tell your narrative along with you. And so, stemming from that, I think further along the lines of Cavalero and Aristotle's mimesis and revisit the process of motion capture that I utilized during the making of I Took a Lethal Dose of Herbs. So, the observation is this. It takes multiple people to create one character. And there's somebody who's doing the facial capture, there's somebody who's doing the voice acting, there are all the mocap actors, and they're all used to create the movement, sound, and expression of one character. So each animated character is multiple people. However, with the mocap actors explicitly, and that's true of any animated 3D animation, the mocap actors, however, they do the body movement of not just one character, but they're also, sometimes they are doing multiple characters' movements, or they are doing one part of one character's movement, and then another mocap actor is doing another part of the same character. So their movements get mixed and matched, and there are actually more characters than mocap actors because they become multiple people. So it's multiple into one. And everyone is credited in the credits. And I'm working with them, like right there with them the whole time. And for me, there's really not a hierarchy of the voice actors versus the mocap actors, because everyone's like part of the collaboration equally. But the voice actors are credited with a particular character as their role. And so because it's one voice for one character, there's this like direct association between, the actor to character, which appears as kind of giving a more like value to their credits, or a specific artistic contribution that can be like pointed to. Because it's like a one-to-one relational relationship between the character and the actor. So when I was writing the credits for the project, I was like very irritated by the conventions of film credits, where I was like, oh, should I put all of the names of the characters that all the mocap actors are part of? But then it was like all this text and very confusing. And so this is something that I wanted to kind of revisit and think about more deeply, in terms of like the politics also of mocap libraries. And I see these as like these literal mimetic motion practices or like motion mirroring practices that fit into like Stenger's concept of brooding with common sense. I will further explain in a minute. So Mixamo, I don't know if anyone's used Adobe 3D products, but Mixamo is their mocap library that's used for games and any virtual interactive production. And the motions are all owned by Adobe and licensed by them to users who have an Adobe account. All of the mocap actors are anonymous. Their motions are disconnected from their person or discorrelated and grouped together into like one blobby sort of archive of motions that are, in this list of generic human motions, where the motions are treated as fungible and not unique to a person. So all of the mocap actors, I said that, are anonymous. And these extractions of a motion of a human body disconnected from the person is a part of this technological process of virtual mimetic production that becomes an emblem, I think, of the very problem that the populist sort of brooding is drawing their anger from, which is that what they perceive to be, if not true, is still a perception, the erasure of having like a relevant presence. And so there is a film that I want to play a clip from. This is Terry Notary, who's a motion capture actor who has played a lot of roles as monkeys and apes. So he was in the new Planet of the Apes and is a lot of, in a lot of different films, but is really known for doing the sort of ape-like performances, but is not ever recognized for his movements as a mocap actor because it's always represented by the model of the ape. However, the film The Square in 2017 by Ruben Ostlund is a film that casts him as an actor in it. And it's an Eat the Rich satire centered in the art world that exposes the art world's shallowness and hypocrisy. And early in the film, there's a performance artist that Terry plays that is really kind of, he's acting as an ape and antagonizing the crowd as part of the entertainment.
Hello. Stop it. Stop it. Very funny. Go on, go away. Go away. Okay, show them. Show them.
Oh, okay, so, yeah, I think that the fact that the scene is what it is, but also that it is using a mocap actor who hasn't ever really been recognized for his emotions is hitting on this thing of like the brooding of the commons is this antagonistic, I'm not gonna participate in these systems of knowledge that you're saying are the expert systems, so I'm gonna act like a monkey in a violent way towards you to kind of make a commentary on that. And the actor himself, even in an interview, talked about how bizarre it was that like people have like recognized him after the movie and said things about his role and like, how great he was in it because he's been doing this for so long in Hollywood films and like no one's ever acknowledged his work. So there is this kind of way that the mocap actors are being turned into an amorphous blob that is no longer recognized by the systems of recognition. They become forgotten, set aside, nameless, and faceless. And in this way, they embody a political class divide between actors with a voice and actors without a voice, literally and also politically. Okay, part 4. The crowd and the masses. So in her work on the ontology of contemporary politics, Adriana Cavalero also speaks of the nature of populism and of mimesis and how digital populism misconstrues participatory democracy in a way that instead actually becomes a process of totalitarianism. And she speaks about the way that the people become a mob, like a single body, acting in unison, rather than as unique voices. Morality. And she says, there is, quote, there's a dangerous demagogic and populist mimesis. I fear this version of mimesis deeply, also because I have studied the phenomenon of totalitarianism. I fear mimesis, contagion, attraction, and the dissolution of subjectivity. This too means for me to shake off one's responsibility. All guilty, no one guilty. And then, quote, at the moment, I am reflecting exactly on the difference, if not opposition, between plurality and masses. Masses are a form of collectivity in which subjectivity dissolves and through a mimetic process becomes only one enormous and amorphous subject that is called, in fact, masses. Plurality, a category I take from Arendt, is the exact opposite. It is the paradoxical plurality of unique beings, namely, in Arendt's terms, the human condition par excellence. In Arendtian terms, uniqueness and plurality are just two categories that implicate one another reciprocally. In this sense, they are the opposite of the masses. So, I take Cavarero's concept of mimesis and its relation to the masses, the crowd, and the political ontology of the populist mob, and think through how it applies to the representation of the crowd in virtual production. The rendering of the crowd is now tied to automation and to AI generators. And the way that AI generators in 2D make crowds is through a process of hyperreality in which a generative adversarial network is trying to produce a mimesis of human action tied to an emotional appearance. However, I don't know if it's because there's no actual reference to a human action. The 2D renderings make everyone appear as if they're having one single emotion. In other words, the immediate knee-jerk way that the AI produces a crowd is to make a mob. There's no uniqueness to each expression, as Cavalero points out would be necessary for a political pluralism. Perhaps because it's easier or less complicated to think about a range of emotions to represent, the AI generates a single emotion for everyone in the crowd. Each image of a person is expressing the same level of emotion as if they are in unison. Or is it that it's easier to render the crowd this way, or is there something inherent to the technological processes of rendering a crowd that tends towards the totalitarian control of the masses? I don't know. So this is the new work that I'm working on right now. It also requires a bit of explanation. It's tentatively titled Pre-Game and is a very, very much a work in progress, and I'm doing it in collaboration with Alina Nazmiva, who is a fellow in the School of Architecture at University of Michigan. And one of kind of a multi-pronged project, but we're attempting to create a cyber-feminist virtual reality tailgate installation as a type of cultural intervention. And we're putting it on campus in a shipping container in the middle of the campus at University of Michigan. And the reason for the concept of the tailgate is that it's basically because University of Michigan has the largest football stadium in the United States. And there's really big football games every Saturday during the fall. And one of the things that is a common tradition is the rival fans come to watch the football games, and their slogan that they chant and wear t-shirts is "Ann Arbor is a whore." That's what like fills the, kind of chants in the crowd. It's like their way of insulting our team. So we were like, well, what if we created like a cyber feminist tailgate where like that, we were gonna like rethink this in completely different ways. So the football audience is not necessarily our direct material that we're critiquing. It's more so that we are using the football audience as this kind of metaphorical substance to talk about this larger idea. And right now what we're doing is a critical analysis of the rendering of crowds and thinking about the imaging of the masses and the way that there is like a subtlety in the violence of representing a large group of people via digital means. And we're trying to think through the rendering of the crowd otherwise, or like how can we like reveal the critical conditions of contemporary virtual bodies and the representation of the crowds like differently. So this is sort of like we're creating, instead of like a football pile, we're trying to like rethink like what does it look like to like pile people in a different way, but also like reveal it as part of this critical commentary. And we've also been using 3D model automators that help us to render 3D crowds as 3D objects. For one, 3D modeling is a very tedious task. And compared with other graphic arts or graphics, 3D model automation has been like slower to develop. But recent developments in neural rendering has come along with the use of neural radiance fields, which has like pushed this pipeline a lot further. And what it does is it performs a kind of inverse graphics in order to automate the rendering of a 3D image from a 2D image. And it's kind of been one of the holy grails of 3D graphics for the last few years, and it's gotten a lot better. But prior to generative neural networks, models were trained on like photogrammetry images, so they would be like images that went around the entire view of an object. And what the NERFs do instead is, because the GANs, they notice like have some latent spatial knowledge that they acquire from generating 2D images. If they manipulate those latent codes, they're able to produce a 3D model out of it. So basically, multiple images are like no longer needed. And I don't like fully understand the algorithmic process of the NERFs, but using singular 2D images instead of multiple viewpoints, the algorithm works by interpreting the way that light is supposed to travel through the air and performs computations that like calculates the density and the color points in 3D space. And then it converts from 2D pixels to 3D pixels, which are voxels. And that conversion between the 2D pixel to the 3D voxel is a neural radiance field. So most of the current NERFs are trained to create singular objects. For example, a 2D image of a shoe becomes a 3D model of a shoe, or a bagel with cream cheese. But in our project, we've been working with using 2D AI images of crowds and the nerf generators to create crowd objects instead of individual objects in order to see how it like renders the image of a crowd. And so there's kind of a couple of things that we are looking at in our analysis. First, like one is thinking about the sort of violence of rendering itself of the crowd. The rendering of the crowd, one as like a populist form that lumps together boundaries and like produces a mob by producing this like blob, and the AI automating the 3D crowds that enhances or sort of like moves alongside of this like mimesis of like a populist behavior, and like reproduces the aesthetics of the crowds in accordance with what Cabrera was saying about like the mentality of the masses. Boundaries are blurred and everyone is smashed together. And there are some different things that we have done to go from the 2D to the 3D in terms of talking about like creating a pile of people versus trying to create different like formations of crowds, basically. But one of the things that the 2D generators don't let you do, if you say like a pile of people in a certain way, it will say like, I'm not allowed to generate violent content. But if you say it in another way, it will create a pile of people. So we sort of like are trying to push the GANs and the NERFs to their own logical conclusion, or like exaggerating the inherent mechanism, where even though the generators won't produce violent images if explicitly asked to do so, when we we change the wording to push it, what it ultimately ends up doing, like in this one I said, a smiling group of people piled in the middle of a football field, like happily climbing on each other. And then it will produce this image. But it like nonetheless like leads to these images that are appear violent as like piles of bodies or casualties of war. And this image I think is really striking because to me it like produces what looks like a massive pile of skulls. And it's, this is what I asked. It was like a group of people wearing hot pink are climbing on top of each other in the middle of a football field. If I put like football and happiness somewhere in there and they're like, okay, and then it still generates this very, it has this like visceral effect. I would never think of producing this image as an artist myself, but then I'm like, oh my God, it just looks like a pile of skulls. And so we take that and then with the NERF, extracting it, there's a lot of problems like going from the 2D to the 3D with the NERF, but really interesting kind of results as well. So with this one, the image, rendered in 3D also looks like this like swelling wave, which has a sort of like weird, powerful force, like a tsunami, and like turning it around, you can see like on the inside, there's all of these objects that also look like the pile of skulls. So it just looks like a wave of a pile of skulls that is like foaming around. And the indictment here is that there's an inherent violence in the rendering of crowds, especially in automated tools for like virtual production. While populism expresses a false notion of the people in charge or confuses itself for participatory democracy, as Cabrera said, the mass rendering of the crowd also reveals this like centralized control mechanism where in fact people have power, no individuality, and are smashed together into this like wave of some other kind of automated creature. Okay, so ultimately the question that we are looking to figure out is whether or not, can we make a critical feminist VR project that fractures itself in the process of exposing different modes of like mass virtual production? Like, can we like talk about the way like the rendering of the crowd and the motion and have it sort of like deconstruct itself in a way that is going to be fruitful. And we take it as a place to insert a kind of intervention, a virtual body that will reveal the multiple people behind one virtual body, or thinking about, you know, the different ways that we can like expose it through the process of making things. You know, they look like really yummy objects too. To me, like I want to like chew on them, or like stress balls. So there's also this really like conflicting vibe around it. But that's the question: is like, is that something that we can do? Final thoughts. The aesthetics of digital mimesis have been established by online culture, social media, memes, image boards, and viral content for the past 30 years or so. With the rise of VR, XR, and XR as a mass media in the past 8 to 10 years, and the availability of open source tools, free game engines, and 3D model automation, the tools of virtual production have opened space for new forms of mimetic virtualities and aesthetics of virtual mimesis that potentially reshapes the aesthetics of the digital commons. However, unlike the earlier era of the internet that was thought to have potential as a democratizing technology, the 21st century has like fully made it clear that that's not true, and that it's actually a space of populism and for totalitarianism to take hold. And as Kawamura says, the individualism reformatted in networked version and demagogic neo-authoritarianism go together seamlessly. So we've seen that now, we understand that now. My question that I'm looking to kind of further unpack is, you know, are there then counterpoints or other ways to conceptualize the people and the masses via digital aesthetics, and can there be a different virtual aesthetics of the commons? Is that possible? And I will end with a couple more quotes. So in her more recent works, Caballero talks about mimesis as also political togetherness, in which she states, I learned from Aaron to think of politics in terms of relationality, of an interactive being between that entails a distinctive form of togetherness. And this togetherness is not the same as other ways of being together, because we could be together if we are friends, if we are lovers, if we walk together and we work together. Indeed, it is a special form of togetherness, a political form of togetherness, in which we experience a peculiar emotion that Hannah Arendt calls, of course you know, public happiness. And then one of the things that she continues to focus on is that we need to continue to theorize the difference between the two, between togetherness and the masses, to avoid confusing mass and plurality. So one of the things she says is that she also shares the attention to different forms of affects at play via rituals, dance, singing, and music. We can indeed open up a different way of being in common that does not culminate in a fascist fusion. So all of the things that she names are like very historical art forms, very bodily art forms. And my question as a digital media artist is that if that can also be included in this, is there a reactivation of common sense in the sense of Isabel Stenger, or a pluralist togetherness that can be applied to virtual production, to a digital aesthetics of the commons? Can there be an aesthetics of the digital commons that does not end in populist/reactionary expression? Is there a way to reactivate the space of digital virtuality that accounts for the grouping of the people? I don't know the answer to that, but I'm trying to figure that out next. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvette.
Yeah.
Great. So yeah, we'll move to questions. If people in Zoom have questions, you can put them in the chat and I'll see them.
Hi, Zoom.
I have a question. So I work in VR and I've worked with the nerds before, and they're very difficult to actually manipulate inside the image. I was wondering if you found some ways to do that. And I also, I'll just ask some questions so I don't chime again. It's just like interaction, choice, multiplayer, like how much are you thinking about that when you're thinking about the common and bringing people together and like, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. So we have just started to switch into Unreal and trying to, right now we're just working with shaders to try to like morph between one to the next. So we're really early. We have not tried anything else yet in terms of like working with the Nerf, the game engine. But I understand that it will be hard. And then in terms of interaction, so we're more so focusing on spatial interaction by making an installation with furniture that you have to like interact across the space with another person. So there's a part of our project where we have sort of like furniture that we are building to be a part of it, where the digital and the physical have to go together all the time, that it can't ever be just the physical experience that you are like having. But we haven't thought about, I mean, are you asking if this project will have like digital interaction?
Yeah, I mean, you know, like the game engines lend themselves to real time, you know, things like I'm wondering, yeah, how you're thinking about that when you're working with these mediums. And I guess choice, interaction, those are kind of the main things.
Yeah.
But maybe you have other ways that you're thinking about.
I mean, in the other VR project that I have, like all the interaction is very minimal. I come more from like a time-based media approach and animation and filmmaking approach. So interaction in my projects are, you can do things, but this is gonna happen regardless of what you do inside of the interaction. So they're kind of more like Easter eggs where things will like happen, or the phone rings, you can pick it up, but the story is still gonna happen no matter what. I don't have a lot about interaction in mind of digital interaction. Yeah. Sorry.
No, it's okay, sorry.
Can I interject for just a moment and suggest that if you stop your screen sharing, then we can create just a more inclusive experience.
I am not on.
Oh, you're not on?
If I stop the.
She's plugged in directly with.
Oh, okay.
Carol's got to be.
I just stopped my.
But you just need to how to when it's seeing the presentation.
What you have.
This is on.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I have a question. So I mean, one thing I liked was the way that you said you weren't suggesting a causal relation between VR timeline and Q-anon timeline, but you also didn't say that you're not suggesting. You know what I mean? And I feel like there's something there, and I guess that's really what you're asking about. Things go together with the way that these virtual masses become real masses, or vice versa, or in some relation, without necessarily it being a unidirectional causal, right? So I'm just wondering, because you're also questioning sort of the timeline that media studies and media history has given us about like the shift from mass media to so-called new media, which I guess people don't call it that anymore. But I mean, you know, it was really about the question of the shift from the mass to something else, something visualized, something whatever, right? And I wonder, like, what, because it feels like that story of new media, as you're also suggesting, you know, I mean, it was incomplete, it was utopian, all kinds of things. Utopian in a weird way, because individualism is like a democratic ideal, in, you know, in the sense that it was kind of being theorized. So I wonder what this kind of confluence of these media forms and reality forms kind of tells us about media history after people stop talking about new media?
Yeah, that's a really interesting kind of way to think about it. I mean, I also, so there's, I took it out, but there was a part where I was kind of talking about Fukuyama's The End of History, right? Like, so history is ended because neoliberal capitalism has solved any like ideological conflict between the communists and the capitalists, but then in the last few years, Fukuyama took it back and was like, "Oh, history's not over yet. This is."
I think there's been multiple reboots, right?
Multiple reboots, right? Like, oh yeah, there's like the neo-fascist. Like, we're in a different. There's been a shift to the political era, and I think this is like alongside of that. Is that like there was mass media, and we went away from the mass media model. Like the Society of the Spectacle is like broadcast television, and like the state films. Nationalist films, and then there's the like new media wave where like utopia of democracy be participatory via digital means. So yeah, I'm trying to say like that is not where we are anymore, and there is a return to something more like a mass media model. It's different. I mean, also I start with the headsets, even though I'm saying it's this whole ecosystem, but there has been, since I started trying out working with VR things, it's like everything's meta now. Meta bought Oculus, and there's this monopoly capitalism of you can't really do an independent VR anymore. You have to use the mainstream headsets if you want to show it to anyone. I mean, you could build your own, I guess, still, but then that doesn't really. It's a long process. And then there's I was doing a lot of like the WebXR when it came out with the A-frame library that Mozilla was put out, and I was like really excited about that because I was like, oh, you can just use open source library to create web VR, and then they fired their whole like WebXR team, and there's like a lot of legacy libraries. Space was getting bought up by all of the bigger companies. So it feels like that space, it's like big broadcast, big networks that own everything again. I haven't worked out all of it, but there's definitely some way to return to like thinking about this kind of previous era that is returning in a new way, kind of this like virtual way. Yeah. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, thank you for the great talk. I feel like I have a not so great question because it feels like a bit of a cliche, even though it just came out. But the Apple Vision Pro, and it's, I guess it's mass marketization of AR, similar to how you're talking about the mass marketization of VR through Oculus Rift. I know since we're just seeing it on the ground, I mean, like I literally saw somebody like hour ago using it, and there was a whole spectacle around it. There was somebody live streaming them and all of this type of stuff. It was really wild. But it was in relation to your ideas around how to represent the masses in the population through digital means. I'm wondering about how this is playing. This might play a part, since despite I feel like AR incorporating the virtual into as an overlay across physical environments, it's literally making a barrier between you and the outside world, which it seems like Apple's very aware of, and that's why they have the simulated FaceTime stuff and all of this. But I'm just curious about how that might be playing into your ideas around mocap and populations and all this type of stuff.
Yeah, I think with AR, I've seen a lot of stuff. I mean, I haven't tried the new Apple headset. I'm not really like, I don't care about like trying the newest thing. Like I'm still on Oculus 2 and I don't care because that's what I have in my house. It's just a change, like my project doesn't, I mean, I have to update it. Like these things get so, the projects that I love from the Oculus Go that I can't like watch anymore because it's just like discontinued any support and the apps don't work anymore. And I'm like, that was 2 years ago. But I think with augmented reality, I've seen a lot more stuff of like how to make your workers work through the augmented interface better, and they're like in an Amazon warehouse, like finding objects in augmented reality. So I mean, I think there's like a really clear line of like, how does that like gonna directly go into an analysis of like the people and the masses. It's like the automation of the perception of work and how you're working is like being controlled. What's that film where the guy has the contacts on his eyeballs and he's like remote operating a robot that is.
Sleep dealer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like it's like Sleep Dealer.
Yeah, I see that, thank you.
Yeah.
I have two questions that aren't really related at all, so I'll just like start with the first one in a second. But I'm curious with the discussion of crowds, and especially with football crowds, how much you've thought about like synchronized movement. Because when I think of football crowds, I think of like they're all doing the wave, or they're all doing like some certain like hand signal at the same time. And I'm sure like in an artistic sense, trying to represent that is like it's already hard already to get the 3D rendering and to have them move all together. But I do think that's like, I'm curious, like what have you like considered or approached that at all? And I also like in terms of like, I think that really adds an interesting valence to like, dissolving the subjectivity into a single subject when they are all doing the same thing.
Yeah, we actually have, I took my presentation down, but there was the cover image, and it's also the image from the talk flyer. There's like, we were like playing with the piles and like trying to figure out like, can we like choreograph certain movements? It's actually easy to have like a bunch of characters do the same motion, one after the other, because you just like apply the same motion just at a delay. So what we were doing instead was like looking at like flocking, sort of like a flocking algorithm, but in Unreal we use the like AI sort of agent to like say like if you're near this thing, like fall down, so that like kind of trying to like choreograph ready to fall down in a way instead of doing the wave. We had about 100. I should say, Alina, who's my collaborator, did this. But we had about like 100 figures that were like doing this sort of like choreographed flocking all down, which is a part of, sort of have these like few different scenes that we're working on right now though. So it may or may not be something that we like continue to do, but yeah, I think none of the things that we are trying to do are like mimic like what it is actually like to be like in a football audience. So it's like not what we're not like, we're trying to make it recreate the experience of being in the stands. Like we're doing the very opposite of that. But then the choreographed movements they don't necessarily look like that. They end up looking like these not really logical, like why is everybody falling? That's where we're at with that. But did you have a second question?
Yeah. This one I was also curious about, and you when you were talking about how you started with the verbal prompts to create the images and then turn that into the 3D ones. And you made a comment obviously about like how you had to kind of like phrase it in ridiculous ways to get it. But I'm curious like if you got in your own work so far, if you've gotten more into like how to create these like, kind of like deformed objects, you do have to end up like deforming the words themselves to create them.
Say the last part again?
Oh, the fact that like when you're creating these, objects that you say like are kind of like deformed that have violence enacted against them, the phrases that you're prompting become like you have to start deforming those as well to actually make it in the first place.
Yeah, I think I was never asking for something explicitly violent, but when I said like a pile of people that are, it was like the way that I phrased it would either be seen as like, I didn't know that was going to be considered something violent. So I'm not really changing what I'm asking for. I'm just putting it in a different context that is relevant to the project still, but I think the part that we are just kind of trying to think through is how there can be something apparent with the rendering process of the crowds. Like, how can we like visually morph from like one to another and like show this? But the words are, we have a separate, we have this like essay that is ongoing. So like there are these like parts of the essay that are gonna be it's kind of weird to talk about this work because it's so work in progress. So I feel like it's not meant to be about like what the work is gonna be because that's like happening in the process of it. But this part of it is more like thinking about, the reason why I'm thinking about some of these concepts is because of just in these initial stages, like saying like, like the way it's working with crowds is making me think about these like political concepts in a way that I hadn't really expected. Maybe that's the information.
I have a follow-up question. It gets to the way you said you're having to phrase things. Is it more an issue of phrasing it in a way that will get the image or get what you are attempting to get because of I'll call it the concept of garbage in, garbage out, meaning it's not specific enough? Or are there really built into the program or the application judgments? Meaning that, because you said it perceives it as violence, or it won't do something that is considered violent, or it is stopping certain renderings or certain actions that it appears to be making a judgment about.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, and so I'm just curious whether that is something that is built in, and so you are bypassing the judgments by coming up with words to try and get around the censor. What comes to mind is the whole, the whole debate over places like Facebook, Meta, all of them where posting things online that were considered offensive or triggering or problematic. And so they supposedly had people that were reviewing posts, reviewing contents, and making determinations about what would or would not be allowed. And so I'm curious whether embedded in the tools that you're using, there are judgments or rules.
There are, but they're not, they don't reveal. So I mean, in a lot of like analysis, there's like a percentage of like how much that they don't show you like how it came to its, and then also it depends on, like I don't have access to like the back end, but even the people who have the access to the back end, I mean, depending on what tool we're talking about, there's a black box. But there's a black box, but there's the output, which is also not in the like programs that I'm working on, but there'll be, there are other programs where you can see like it's certainty level where it says, like it's 52% certain that it's violent content, or it's, 75% certain that it's this type of content, but like how it got to that is like through this, that's what happens in the like deep learning training of like how many things it has as a reference point. So yeah, the judgments.
Whether it's algorithmic, whether it's algorithms that have been built to try and see whether certain criteria are satisfied or not.
Yeah.
I use judgment as a shorthand way of getting at whether you have human beings doing it or whether you have human beings creating an algorithm that is trying to ascertain. And so that's why I was very curious about whether it's really having to come up with terms to avoid the terms that the algorithm is going to count negatively, versus whether it is just a matter of trying to craft the language for what you are seeking to render. To me, there may be a subtle difference, but to me, they're two different things.
Yeah. I mean, not all, like some of it is visual too. So not all of it is words. I rarely am using, I use the text for the 2D, but when I go to the 3D, I'm using an image. And so sometimes I'm even manipulating the image. So how it views an image and like what is in my mind. The images are the ones that cause the most problems. But I also, there is, so in Cavalera's work, she talks about the way she uses Plato as a philosopher and pushes it to like the extreme of the thought. If you take it all the way to its extreme, and she calls it like a technique of theft. And so I'm trying to like also think of like, in this case, like a technique of theft is to like use the sort of like thing that it does, but like push it to, can I like steal its way of saying like something is violent, and instead of saying something is violent, like show another kind of violence like through it. So it's like I'm like stealing its way of doing that, a way of saying something's violent or not, and showing like you're violent but in this other way, which is what Cabrera does about Plato.
No, but that's what I think is part of the interesting part about what you're doing with this. It's, as you say, it's that you're pushing the boundaries, you're pushing the algorithm to, create your, to push boundaries, to see whether you can achieve your image or how you need to achieve your image.
Yeah, and I think it's more so about the concept of violence within it. Yeah.
I want to ask about football. Because I think it's actually such a mirror for what you're thinking through in a really crazy way, because on the one hand, as a sort of technique of bonding, like it is one of the strongest vestiges of like a former broadcast era where like everybody's rallied around this progression of the narrative of the season or whatever, and like the Super Bowls and stuff. Like it is one of those kind of old-fashioned broadcast things. But then on the other hand, in a football stadium, it's like a preview of what surveillance could be, because they have all those like voxel cameras and they're able to reconstruct like the live view of what it looked like for number 14 or whatever to run through those guys. And when you look at it, you see all the voxels and everything. And there's like there must be like next to the field, like a truck of guys in Unity or in Unreal who are like creating that visualization, because it always comes like 20 seconds after play or whatever, which is incredible, just technologically. So in a way, it's like, and in that moment when they do that, they're like taking this voxel field of unindividuated data and then like particularizing it as much as is probably possible, because each player has their kind of narrative that surrounds them and everything. So yeah, I just wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, another thing that we've been doing is looking at all these like football. Okay, so it's not supposed to be about football, but then of course it ends up being like we have to dig into football. So, one of the things that's really fascinating is like realizing like football players are like the most surveillanced people ever. Like they have sensors on every like part of their body. There are like live charts of like their motions, and you can like analyze like, oh, the tip of their toe is like not in the right spot, and they need to like I'm like, they have these like real-time analytics also on like all of these things. So but they're also like their names on there. They're not like the mocap actors who you don't know their name. They're like famous and they get paid a lot. So there's this other relationship there, but they have, the like technologies of like football broadcasting is really robust, and they have, robust is probably the wrong word, but funded, developed, and there's this culture that just like accepts all of it, of like watching it. And I mean, one thing that I think is interesting though is that there are these like ethics in it where it's like, okay, did this or this, it's like they will rewatch to like see the little tip of the call to see like whether or not it was like a fair play or not. And then they would like recall it and then be like, we're taking it back and all this. And I'm like, oh, if only like politics worked like that, where there would be like, oh, you were, you know, something happened that was like unjust to you. And so we're gonna like make sure we tracked it for the reason so that it was fair. But of course, that's not how it works. It's like for football, we're gonna just like track all these things and make sure that it's all according to the rules, or no one's like stepping out of their zone. But I don't know, that's the right way to say it. But there is part of the thing that we were looking at was the culture of the tailgate also, and like looking at the way there is, this is like outside of the stadium and like not necessarily tied to like watching the football game. And it's a practice that started during the Civil War of like people taking chairs out and food and like watching like battles of the Civil War, that like little picnics that
That's so insane.
like continued into sports. And as these are like, you know, kind of there are these like space, it becomes a sort of like public space, this public commons that people create to like do a thing, and it's like been associated with both like war and sports. There aren't these public spaces in a lot of like American like city designs. But it's this way of like, okay, there's sort of this line of like, there's something kind of interesting that like people just like pull out chairs and couches and like TVs in a parking lot and everybody starts like sharing food and doing all this stuff that seems kind of nice, but then it's like connected to also this like history of violence. And so there's like the two all at the same time. We're kind of trying to like take the idea of that sort of like, it's sort of like a domestic space outdoors where like people are just creating it more momentarily, can be like inverted in a different way. But there are, yeah, these really, all the like football renderings, augmented reality is probably first invented by football, like the like real-time graphics that like overlay things and you like watch it simultaneously. That's really interesting point.
Just to quickly jump off of that, and I wasn't quite sure of how to like bring it up into conversation, but there's this film that came out last year called Bottoms. Have you seen it? Or has anyone seen it here? Yeah, it's like this football movie that also has like Fight Club. Basically, like there's a bunch of girls who are like, we need to be violent. And so they make a fight club on their own, and then they beat up like the football players. And it's really campy, right? Like it is savage at the very end. There's a lot of bloodshed. But it's so much about expressing your own individuality on the football field, almost Taylor Swift style. And I feel like it's, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it's relevant at all, but yeah, I guess I was thinking about that, and I guess I was also thinking about like Roman arenas and like spaces and things like that, right? To add on to the whole violence of football.
There's also, you know, just like football's, it's just in my face a lot. So I would never have come up with this without like just being at work and I'm like, oh, okay, this is happening again. It's another game, but it's like our team won and everybody is like crawling over the sidelines of the stadium to like go on the field and like do all these things, and it just like looked like January 6th. It just looked like, I was like, is this like safe or what's happening? You know, there's a moment of your like, it's that I don't know what's going on, or like what the crowd mentality is, but those kinds of things that are, I mean, I guess it's kind of like obvious, those connections of like the crowd, like riled up crowd. There's, you know, also the last time we just won like the state, I don't know what it's called, something, but there was like multiple fires set in the city, like the couches are set on fire, which like never happened before. So these kinds of things where I'm like, okay, we're doing that now, like we're setting things on fire outside. But I haven't seen that film.
I think it's on Amazon.
To me, it's interesting, you saying that your project or what you're looking at is tailgates, and the concept of tailgating. But a lot of what you're just describing is actually associated more with the sport or the event rather than the pre-event, which is the tailgating. Because I can think of other sports where you would have things like tailgating and other events, but you don't necessarily end up with fire set, if they win, that kind of, and yet at the same time, you're also seeing more the creation or the use of the same technologies, and now they'll have, watch parties, outside a Warriors game on a screen, and a big, it's a different evolution of tailgating, or, people in McCovey Cove at a Giants baseball game. It's a different form of the tailgating, which is associated with, but almost ancillary to, the event.
Yeah, I think we're really building off of the very local context of where we are a lot, where it really means football.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think Danielle had a question before I did, so.
Okay.
Go first.
Yeah, okay, it's more of an observation, but I can question. About the mocap libraries, that just seems fascinating to me. And I guess I'm just kind of perplexed about the idea of a pile versus like a fall, and you're choreographing falls. And then thinking about aesthetics, I mean, in actor training, the fall is like something that's taught, like it's unified, like you learn how to fall. And so that it can be like unified, and you try to take out the individualization. And it makes me think your language of using choreography and directing, which is what you're doing with your work, but you're already working with a canon. And like choreographers often, there's like an expression of like, you can't teach a dancer not to dance. Like it's really hard to seek the pedestrian movement. And I feel like that's what you're kind of trying to do to like jam the way we understand these systems, but yet the systems being, rather than like maybe a totalitarianism, it's built to be directed, which is what you're doing. So just like kind of pushing back on the framework, just that you're setting up, to think through it a little bit more. And I'm also wondering, when did the visualization of crowds really start happening? Because not in the like early days of like in the 90s of this new media democratization of the like digital commons. It's only more since 2016, I would imagine, but I'd really be interested to see when like crowds became needed and like used virtually. And then the last thing is that this seems like the crowd images that you've shown us, and like ones that I call to mind, not only is it like similar affect, but it's also like a similar like focal point of the crowd. Like you rarely see like individuation or like interaction amongst the crowd or looking elsewhere. There's always like one point of reference. So it's funny with these nerfs that you're also like eliminating multiple points of reference, that it's all coming from one like top down perspective. I don't know, there's no question behind that, but it just feels like somehow there's some strange parallelism that's occurring there. But I guess I'm most interested in like the like idea of this choreographed movement. It's embedded in the system, but it's also like part of the canon of how we understand like aesthetics and movement. I mean, military movement, dancerly movement, etc.
Yeah, so you're asking about the choreography of animations?
Yeah, and I know you're like, I'm conflating like the 2D rendering with the animations too, but
Yeah, so one of the, I mean, it's not necessarily that the commentary or like that the commentary is in the visuals necessarily. It's like through the making of the visuals of the commentary also becomes like more solidified. So there's going to be the commentary alongside the visual parts. But one of the things that we have been talking about started with the like history of, you know, the imaging of movement that was like, you know, photography, early film, study of the way that, you know, in the Muybridge photographs of like how a horse moves. So like the early photographs were like to look at things that people hadn't like seen in still in succession to see like what, like, do all of the horse's feet lift off at any one point or not? And so like nobody could answer that question until they were, you know, slowly taking photos in frame of movement. And there's a lot of like sports bodies that are like humans like doing different things to like study like how emotion is created or, you know, what is still by frame look like. But the earliest film is The Workers, one of the earliest films is The Workers Leaving the Factory, which is the Lumiere brothers filming a crowd of people leaving work in France, right, leaving the factory. So this is this classic work that is about a crowd. And a lot of early work, Eisenstein, like the Potemkin set, there's like all these crowds in early film that goes away with the studio model of filmmaking because it's hard to get a crowd in the studio and like film it. So there's all these tricks where people of different varying heights, so like shortest people in the front, tallest people in the back, using like forced perspective to make the crowds look a lot bigger. There's all these like tricks of perspective of camera work that like increase the image of a crowd in the like middle years of like from the studio model to you know, before the digital rendering is really started to use. And then there's like the digital rendering of crowds that you'll see in, you know, things like Lord of the Rings and different kinds of special effects rendering. But there is an era of film where there's like not a lot of crowds. Early film has crowds, and then later film has crowds with digital rendering. It's very hard to film crowds. I mean, documentaries have crowds where there are crowds already, which is different, which is what the Lumiere brothers was. But I mean, the sort of like idea of like watching the workers leave has like always been a part of this imaging of crowds and like watching how the crowd moves. So part of the idea of, I mean, I say choreography, but I'm just really trying to like avoid language of the like smashing together people. Like I'm trying to avoid the like violent language of like what happens when people like run into each other, or thinking about the choreography of, you know, people watch football like it is this normal thing to do. It's a popular form, but if, you know, I don't see the difference between that and like watching dance, but there isn't like, you know, primetime television ballet on where everybody's watching it and people would be like, why is this on? But with football, no one's questioning that. So there's a sort of difference between like thinking about something that's choreographed and a set of rules for a game that like is about like hitting into each other. People get injured intentionally. Dancers get injured too. But yeah, the system is built to be directed. I like that, what you said, in terms of, you mean like as a creative director, like it's meant to be directed. There are these like movements. I don't think, yeah. I guess I'm curious what you mean by the system also here. Do you mean the like actual like technological system or?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, I haven't done any of the rendering myself, so I don't have like experience with that. But yeah, that's what I'm referring to, because that's what you're That's what is kind of the object of your analysis, not the football, but like how the system, I don't know, whatever program you're using is operating.
Yeah, there's things that though are you can't direct also. So like how do you get to, there are so many things that you don't get to see and you don't get to see inside of, and that it's like really complicated in terms of even if you're able to, if you're engineering the system, like knowing how something automated decided this or that. So I think it is also kind of like trying to think about, yeah, how do you direct it otherwise? Or like, how do you like make it do something like not necessarily, like we're not using it in the best way that like what it's made for. It's sort of to like get at something from another angle. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, thanks so much for your talk. I have two related questions. One is a bit more sort of practical about the work in progress, and the other is a little bit more on the theoretical side. I guess on the theoretical side, I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the work that Arendt's concept of responsibility is doing here. That just seemed to me a little bit sort of counterintuitive in terms of what you were doing with Caballero especially. So I was just curious if you could like pull at that a little bit more. And then the practical question, I don't mean to harp too much on the like you're making a football project thing, but I do want to circle back to that because I was curious if there are any, but I'm going to do it anyway. Yeah, no, that's true. But I was wondering if there is any plan to reflect on the figure of the referee, because it seems like that is actually the most sort of Arendtian figure here, sort of caught between these systems of a sort of surveillance and also making judgments about what's going on. Because I mean, sort of football, there's a little bit of there's a conversation about if the official should have like other sports like soccer are much more sort of advanced in terms of like they have these crazy like feedback systems between different officials. They have like video replay now in a lot of the major leagues, but then there's an official behind the camera who's also sort of relaying the information that they see. So there are all these sort of like decision-making loops, and it seems like football is also kind of getting there. I mean, I'm not an expert. I don't like do sports. I don't know, like you all. I don't know. You see how I look. I don't football. But I was just curious if that is sort of also something that could be, I don't know. Is the referee an Arendtian figure is the question, and what can you do with that?
All right.
Have fun with it.
Yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying. I would say, sure, yeah, I think the referee is Arendtian figure, and there's multiple referees who will get together. I don't know what they're saying, but they appear to be having, a sort of like serious debate about whether or not something is going on, and that is like a seat at the table, right? That is like participating in a Arendtian democracy where like the voices are heard, and we are going to not necessarily agree, but we're going to be here to voice something together in a shared space, and that you have to be there doing that in order to be participating. I do want to say that this sort of like me theorizing with Caballero and like talking about this bigger sort of context of the Mimetic virtualities and the like theory that I am bringing in is not necessarily represent what my collaborator thinks about the project. We are coming at it from like different angles, and so this is sort of like my theoretical angle to it. So I just don't want it to also like make it sound like I'm speaking for the both of us, because I keep saying we, but it's also we're coming together from like different points, and I know that she's not really coming at it from that at all.
Okay.
But yeah, part of what I think is really interesting in terms of what it means to like participate in this like public happiness form of democracy. It's not like representational democracy. It's this very fleeting thing that happens in the way that Cavalero explains it about Aaron. So I am also not an expert in Aaron. This is very new, like theoretical territory for me. Like I come from a really different like theory world, so I'm really dipping into like a lot of new theoretical territory. But the way I understand it is that actually democracy only happens in these like very fleeting moments, and it's not something that is constructed through like representational politics. It happens when people come together to make decisions, and when people come together to make decisions and use their voices, like sitting at a table like this, but also in a space where you can voice things and where you can hear, and that is rare, and that's not a constant thing that is always going on. It reminds me of the way like Fred Moten talks about the undercommons and like what it means to be like figuring something out. And that like figuring something out isn't about figuring out something. It's about coming together to figure something out. The fact that we meet together to figure something out is the figuring it out. That is what this participatory process is about. It's the fact that we're doing that. We're not going to figure it out because it's going to change tomorrow and there's going to be another thing. But what we're going to do is come together in this way to figure things out. And that act is the act of this continual process that like needs to be possible all the time. And so I could see that being how like referees, you have to have this sort of space for questioning and figuring out whether or not something was fair. I guess that's what they do. Also, I'm not super familiar with referees like day-to-day, like step-by-step really job is. But you had your first question about responsibility. I guess that's tied in with what I was saying, what I was answering already. I forgot exactly how the concept of responsibility is tied into project or
Just the theoretical framework, but I think you were just speaking to that.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's the question is like, how do you, I mean, on the one hand, that's a great idea, but then can we only do that? I guess my question is like, can we only do that physically in person? Can we only do it by doing this? Maybe that's the answer. Can we ever do that digitally or like in a virtual way? I don't know. That's the question. That's part of the question is like, maybe this is just never going to be that. And like the only way to have that like participatory process where everyone has a voice is through like this actual meeting in person. Like maybe that is just the case. I don't know.
I think that's a really good segue into a question we have on Zoom. And so Miguel Novello wants us to read aloud his question. And so he says, I enjoyed listening so much how the process enacts theory and vice versa, and how new media, access to media dictates the message. I understand the strong relationship of the body or the lack of the body in your work in VR, so could you comment on the idea of losing your body or control over it through the use of VR? And Miguel, I guess for background, is also an artist. So.
Yeah. There is definitely this weird thing about losing your body. I just had my nieces over, and they are 7 and 4, and they tried VR for the first time, and they were immediately like, "Where's my body? Like, what am I?" And I was like, and I read it. I was like, "Oh, it's like 13 plus." I'm like, "Oh, maybe, but so there's this kind of question about VR, about whether or not it is this more embodied experience or not. And I kind of go back and forth. I was talking about this earlier. I have another project, because I have like a lot of VR nausea, and I work in it. So I'm always like having this like nausea feeling, which is a part of this other project that I'm doing, kind of that apart, but one of the things that like people say VR is supposed to do is make you have like more empathy, or this is sort of like empathy discussion around VR. But when you are nauseous, the opposite happens, and you have like total apathy for like anything because you don't care about anything but your nausea going away, your nausea going away. So has the opposite effect of like whatever you're looking at just doesn't matter. You're never going to care about it, and that is different to me than like something like watching a film, where I also feel like very immersed in it, and like I'm not necessarily there, but the effect that the VR has on me, I do have a physiological response, and so like the presence of my body versus not my body in the space of it has an effect. I don't know. I also think that makes that something that is tricky to kind of, you can't really get out of this like view. It's like whatever you're making is going to be like the viewer is in this space. So they're either going to feel like you created a body for them or taken a body away from them, which is another thing to be like constantly like thinking about in terms of the construction of a project. So my VR piece, Lethal Herbs, it was like how and when or if should like the controls ever be taken away? And usually that's like one of the things that they say like never to do, like don't take the controls away from a user because then it will like produce a disorienting effect. But there can be like subtle ways to sort of like play with that in a way that's just like about, you know, the story, like is the character losing control of their life, and so like now all of a sudden you can't. So there's like a part where like the tea, she drinks the tea, and it's like at first it was supposed to be this interactive thing. There's like things that you can pick up, but I just made it so like you don't have any choice. The tea is just going in your face, because this is a moment where the character is losing control of her life. But the presence of, you know, how a body is constructed, I think is also really interesting for VR space in terms of the way that like there are things that you can do. For example, I have this idea I really want to do of like a shared body with other people, and like you have to coordinate with each other. Like you can create these bodies that like can't exist, where you're like the blob, like you're a blob of people, but you all have to like coordinate together in a way to make it work. So there are games like this, and I can't think of one off the top of my head. Where it's like you can't do the next thing until everyone's like on the same, you know, you have to like figure out how to get on the same thing. So these sort of like ways to like construct different bodies, I think is also another area that I'd like to try.
You know Patrick Lemieux's Octopad? Yeah, it's an NES, a Nintendo Entertainment System controller, but it's broken down into all 8 buttons that it has. And each one gets its own controller. So the up arrow, the down arrow is another controller, the right arrow. And 8 people have to coordinate to play a video game. It feels similar to what you're describing, except very much in the physical space, right? But every bit as much mediated by the digital, you know, and in fact, like really provoking, like, you know, the boundary, like what is it?
Yeah, I think there has to be, yeah, like a kind of reason to coordinate. So actually, Shuli Chang has a game. She's a cyber feminist, you know, artist and filmmaker, and she has a game where you fight the AIDS virus, but it only works if you do it with like another person, which I think is a great way to like use that mechanism. Is that like it requires more than one person to fight AIDS, and so it requires more than one person simultaneously for like the game to even work.
Any final questions?
Just want to know if I want to know two things. And it's not about football, but it's about the installation. Is this supposed to be installed where people tailgate? And
Okay,
like,
so-
is that dangerous?
Actually, part of it, so we have this, we're curating a show also. So there's like other work and it's outside of the bell tower. We have, bell tower is a carillon, which is an organ. And we have a cyberfeminist carillonist music composer who is like making a disembodied tower song that will, like, you can hear throughout the whole campus. So we're putting the shipping container in front of the bell tower. And then we're moving it, so it's gonna be there for 5 days. And then we're moving it to a second location that's close to the stadium. And there are these big screens outside of the stadium, which is where people tailgate. People tailgate all over the city though. Like if you walk down the street that is, State Street is kind of like the main street. And then there are like people like playing beer pong in front of the yard, and you know, there's just tailgates all over the place. We did get permission to use the screens outside of the stadium. So we have to figure out what we're gonna put on them because they have to get approved. So we are figuring out how to be able to get the images on the screen. But there's also sort of different, like, they're really simple grids. So you can, I think you can only have like still images. So we might do like a sequence of like still images, QR code that like points you to the map where the shipping container is. We haven't figured that out yet. But yeah, it's definitely near, I mean, the bell tower is like in the center of everything. So it's right near that stuff. Yeah, the university is, it's kind of like interesting in the process of putting it together because all of the systems of things, all of the bureaucracy kind of is bubbling up because people are like, no one has done this before and we don't know like how to treat your project. So we're going to like have you talk to 1 million people.
I'll ask later. Of the nerve generated things and what have you thought about fabricating them? Material objects.
Yeah, we have a fabrication thing happening right now. We're ordering, like, it's super early though, so I don't know, that might be a fail, but fabrication is, we are fabricating like furniture objects, but there's little props and things that we're gonna have around that we are figuring out how to, whether we're fabricating them or not. But yeah, we really wanted to have like the weird like puffy objects like on like a grill, like put a hot dog on. TBD.
Thank you, Yvette. As a general reminder, if you haven't signed in already, please sign in for our records. We do have some extra food, it seems like, left over, so please help yourselves to that because we will have to throw everything else away. And our next event will be on March 12th with Akira Mizuta-Lippitt from USC. So talk title still TBD, but hopefully it'll be fun. So thanks for, yeah.